Today on the Perception and Action podcast, an interview with Julia Blau and Jeff Wagman about their new Introduction to Ecological Psychology textbook. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about a couple extra things that might interest you if you're enjoying the podcast. First, my book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sports Skills, is now available in audiobook format. You can find it on Audible or Amazon. Second, if you're interested in working directly with me, I currently have openings in my monthly mentorship program. This includes monthly Zoom meetings, either one-on-one or with your staff, analysis of your practice designs, and a monthly group discussion with coaches and instructors from a range of different sports. To find out more, please go to patreon.com/perceptionaction. Now on to the show. Okay, today I'm joined by Julia and Jeff to talk about their really great new text, Introduction to Ecological Psychology. So thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
Maybe I'll start with you, Julia. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background, and maybe how did you get into ecological psychology? What I might say, seeing the light, but we won't buy it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah.
It's a sort of meandering path, but my name is Julia Blau, and I'm an associate professor at Central Connecticut State University. I got my PhD at UConn. It's funny because I wasn't a psych major as an undergrad for the first year that I was there. And then I took an intro psych class and just fell in love with it and ended up taking sensation and perception with Claudia Corella. And I literally went up to her after class one day and was like, how do I just be you when I grow up? And that's how I ended up in ecological psych, is because I took her class, and it was eye-opening and amazing. And it felt like it explained so many things that other things hadn't, and that it could be applied to so many areas. And I found that really exciting. So that's how I ended up there. And she said, well, you should come and be my grad student, right? Like that's how you get started. So I ended up going to CESPA and being her graduate student at UConn.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's, I will say the Claudia and Claire's direct perception book is one of the first moments I would put as my, that got me interested in this. So yeah. I can sympathize. She's very good at explaining some hard concepts. Yeah. How about you, Jeff? Yeah.
Well, I'm Jeff Wagman. I'm a professor at Illinois State University. And my introduction to ecological psychology came in college. I went to Franklin and Marshall College, which is a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. But one of the professors there was Ed Reed. Mm-hmm. And I took a class with him. And I felt then the way I felt several years later when I took a course with Bob Shaw. And that is, this person is saying something extremely important if only I could understand it. Fortunately, I also had another professor at the time named Fred Owens, and he was a more straightforward psychophysics perception guy, and he sort of helped me see what Ed was talking about. And then when it came time to go to graduate school, I applied to people doing perception action work. And when I visited the University of Connecticut, I just felt really at home. It felt like a place I wanted to be. I was, in fact, what impressed me most were the students. Mm-hmm. The other students in my program, the more senior students, were people like Mike Riley, who's now at the University of Cincinnati, and Brett Fajan, who's at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
I think so.
And I said, I want to be like them. So I guess Julia wanted to be more like Claudia. I wanted to be more like these people who just seem so smart and so clever. And so I went to the University of Connecticut, and here I am.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's a great, you both have come from the heartland of the ecological psychology. So that's great. So I'm going to start off with, this is a question like everybody asks when they interview authors about a book. It's such a trite question, but I think it's really important in this case. And maybe I'll start with you, Jeff. Why did you write this book? Why did you think we needed this book?
We wrote this book because someone needed to do it. Damn it.
Yes. Amen. Yeah.
We had collaborated on an edited book a few years prior. And so we knew we could work together. And, we had heard rumors that there was going to be an intro eco psych book somewhere along the lines, but it never materialized. And we just said, you know what? And then COVID happened, and we said, well, let's see. We got a lot of ideas. We got a lot of time. We're going to do this. We're really happy we did. People seem to, we described this in the preface or something, where we say, everyone we described it to said, that's a great idea. And we really hope that people feel that way now that it's done and it's out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. Like as someone, I think we've all had the experience of teaching something like sensation and perception and having one or two lectures on the ecological approach. Well, even the title of that course, goes against the ecological approach. And so trying to point people to resources to get them started.
Yeah,
it's very tricky. Yeah, Julia, do you want to?
What I noticed was that there was a lot of, anytime someone would publish a paper that was comprehensible to an undergrad, that paper would make the rounds of, here's a paper you can actually assign in your class, and here's a paper you can assign in your class. And I heard so many stories of people saying that they were cobbling together their entire ecological section out of, those primary sources. And that's not a coherent story, right? Like that's not all one thing. So that's why I suggested it, and we ended up doing it.
Yeah, no, I think putting it together and showing how they link is, a really important part. So, yeah, no, as I said, I'm grateful for it. Just giving people a place to start. So, Julia, also may I start with you. So, the first part of the book, you have starting the conversation and where we went wrong. So, can you talk a little bit about that? There's always I find this weird thing where to explain ecological psychology, you have to explain the traditional view first and then build it off of that. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts about how you wanted to do that?
Yeah, so it's true. You have to tell the traditional view first. And part of the reason is because if you just start in with the ecological view, your average person will be like, well, yes, that's just my experience. That's not science. You're just talking about my experience. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it feels like such an obvious thing that we're able to get up and walk around and pick up a cup and sit down on a chair. So you have to first explain, no, really, this is a whole area of study. People have been doing this for a long time and seeing this as a really intractable problem. But you're right, it is actually simpler than that. And so you kind of have to show the opposing side as, in order to understand why we're even spending this much time on the foundation of it. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is why I decided that. Also because, like I said, Claudia Carello, huge influence. And that is how she taught sensation and perception to me, all those years ago. She started with the classical. So I did too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's so ingrained in people, and the idea the brain's like a computer, it just, it's hard. You have to kind of start there. Yeah.
It's everywhere. And I don't care what area of psychology you're in, the idea of the central executive is everywhere. Mm-hmm. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine who's in social psychology, and she kept talking about the central executive and the central executive. And I was like, oh, this really is just everywhere. So.
It is. And I can tell you from sports too, it's in the train. People don't see it. You have to kind of pull it out that what your training method is built off what your theory is. So Jeff, what about you? What are how you wanted to start the conversation? That's one of your points too as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that idea of the central executive or the homunculus or whatever you want to call it, that thing that does the thinking and the moving,
Mm-hmm.
that to me is really, that's the wedge that keeps psychology from meeting up with natural science.
Mm-hmm.
That's why psychology gets the label special science, or it's a
Mm-hmm.
as a social science. It's not quite on the same level as the other sciences, only because we can't get over this idea that there's something that does the work. And I think once we jettison that, I really do think that just they just become, they get unified. Yeah, it's a challenge, I think, to explain to people that this is something to be studied. And I think we just wanted to lay out the traditions, because the traditions, it's just a handful of choices along the way in the history of studying perception that create this avalanche. Is okay, well, the brain is a computer. It gets data, it processes, and then outputs. And we just wanted to, okay, well, what if instead of making that choice, you made this one? And what if instead of making that one, you made this one? Then it avalanches the other way, and you end up with an ecological perspective. So we just wanted to find like those 3 or 4 points that create the tipping point.
Yeah.
It's really easy to just few decisions, and those decisions in that time, in that context, make a whole lot of sense about reductionism and about, it's perfectly understandable why we ended up where we are. And we just wanted to say, yeah, but imagine a universe where those decisions were not made, and where would we be? And we could be in this space where there's no homunculus, and we are not a special science.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that. And sometimes I use the analogy of trees, like indirect versus direct perception are like roots that get planted in a different field, and then they just grow out into totally different things that, they all make sense within their own. But you're right. Sometimes we forget those just choices along the way. So, no, Julie, did you have more you wanted to add? Or?
Oh, I really liked the way he put that.
Yeah.
I like the way he thinks. That's why we work well together.
Yeah, no, I think, and I like your point, Jeff, about one of the common things I find people tell me is once they get into this in a very specific way, like in sports, they start to see it everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. It's really it's not just a science of psychology. It's built, connects with all these other biology, nature, So I think that's a complexity science, whatever you want to call it. I think that's a real strength of it. Yeah.
And more than that, too, my main area of research is on aesthetics. Mm-hmm. I look at the way that we structure films, and I wrote a paper on how people should structure narratives in stories. And all of it's based in this ecological understanding of perception. So I agree. I think it can apply to just so many things. Mm-hmm. And when you start reconceptualizing the person as not needing this, central executive, but being this dynamic system instead, it opens up a whole other world to explain a lot of things.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. And so getting into a little more like kind of the meat of it, like the content, I noticed that I believe one of your first section, you're talking about visual perception, that I think this is a Michael Turvey title, right? Getting light into the muscles. I believe I interviewed Bill Warren a few months back, and I think that was one of the turning points for him. That title made him want to go to hear this talk, and then he was forever changed. So, well, before that, maybe so you start off with affordances. Can you talk a little bit, Julie, about kind of the challenge of and kind of explaining affordances to people, and how you tried to get that across?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, to answer that question, I want to tell you a story first, which is the way we were sort of thinking about the whole book, which is I said, I need to be able to hand this book to my mother and have my mother be able to read it and know what I do for a living, right? Because it's sort of a running joke, right, that none of our mothers know what we do for a living, or our parental figures, because it's odd and unusual, and we're studying things that people don't often study. And we needed to be able to hand this to a relatively intelligent, relatively educated layperson and have them be able to get what we do. And so that was our goal throughout all of it, and was our goal when we're writing, the philosophy chapters. It was our goal when we were writing the chapters on how the information is structured. Always, could my mom understand this? But could my mom understand this? We'd write revision notes back and forth. This section, my mom would not get this. Could you mom this up a little bit here? And the affordance chapter, actually, I think, was one of the easier ones to do that with, because Jeff is an expert on affordances. So that is one of the papers one of the chapters that he wrote the first draft on, and was sort of easy to get into that language in a way that the average person could understand. Also, because, again, the same thing I said with the first 4 chapters, your average person isn't going to have a trouble with the idea that you see something as pick upable, because that's very much in keeping with our lived experience, right? I can't sit on that. It's too tall. I can't pick that up. It's too big, right? We have immediate feelings about how to engage with our surroundings. And so when I say, oh, what we see are affordances, the layperson is like, yes, and it's only the people who have been sort of immersed in this, a different kind of science, that go, wait a second, that's so different than anything we've been talking about. The average person, that's the way it feels. That's the lived experience.
Yeah, no, that's great. Jeff, what are your thoughts about, affordances?
That concept of affordances was something I always was aware of. I played a lot of sports as growing up, and I still do. And I always knew there was something to describe the way in which we take advantage of opportunities to perform or do, and I never knew the word for it. And when I first came across that word at some point, it was a revelation to me. I was like, that's what I've been trying to, that's what I've been thinking about. That's this thing that is so, was so salient to me, but I couldn't quite, I didn't know that anybody would or could study that. It just seemed like this was just a fact of life, that there's ways in which we fit, and our behaviors fit, and I couldn't articulate it, and it just made a whole lot of sense to me, and I wanted to try to allow other people to sort of see the intuitiveness that and the way I explain it to students is you have countless everyday behavioral successes every day, right? Thousands of things could go wrong in your interactions with the world, and they don't. And that's amazing. And that's what I wanted to get across to them. That, I did a demonstration in class the other day. I said, I'm going to do something amazing. And I picked up my, cup of water. And they were like, what? And it's like, but don't you see that? That is amazing, right?
Absolutely incredible behavior.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think about, did any of, when you walked here, you walked through a crowded university campus, how many of you just crashed into a tree? How many of you just tripped and fell down? That's amazing. And I just wanted to see if I could get that people to appreciate that smoothness of our interactions.
It's so funny. I do almost the same thing in my class, except that I walk in between the desks, right? They have all their desks out there, and I walk in between them. And I'm like, look at this absolutely incredible behavior. I do the same thing.
I love that. I think we tend to want to focus on when it goes wrong, right? A great example is illusions, right? we misperceive depth, and and then we hide the 99.999% of the time we get it right. And so I think that's a great example. The other one I was, how hard it's been to get robots and AI to do those simple things like walk through a cluttered room has taken a long time. And a lot of it's made it work by using kind of ecological approach. So yeah, I think that's a really good, also think, I don't know if you feel the same. I think people, like you guys are saying, they go, that makes sense. I think what's harder to get across is, like you were saying, Jeff, like if you accept this, it changes everything about how you think perception and action work. Right? That's a piece I don't think people grasp as well. Yeah.
For me, it was an epiphany. It's like, the way I describe this to people is it was like looking at one of those reversible figures and suddenly going, it's a vase. It's been a vase this whole time.
Yeah.
I have been looking at the faces and now I see the vase, and oh my gosh, I've been describing this wrong to everybody. And just that shift, and I can never see the faces anymore. I'm never gonna. It's face transition, and now I can't believe I ever saw the faces. It's so clearly a vase to me, and I think that's the way I feel about once you make that shift, once you see I think there's a reason people, as I mentioned before, I think there's a reason people made the choices they did. And I think there's a reason that people persist in pursuing the computational approach, because it does explain stuff, right? It gets us. It's like, we used Newton's physics to get to the moon. Newton's physics is wrong, but it was good enough to get us to the moon. Well, it's kind of the way I see this. The more computational approach, I don't think it's right, but I do see how it tells a story and it gets us part of the way there. But it hits a ceiling. And I think that's what the ecological approach does, is it says, okay, let's get the rest. If we take this approach from the beginning, we never hit that ceiling. We can do everything that the computational approach can do and more.
Get it.
I want to amplify that I see the same dichotomy in looking at the body as a machine versus looking at the body as a system. Right. So I teach this in my class where we had the machine metaphor approach, right? So the body is an automaton, right? It works the same way my car does. There's individual parts. Each part has a job, and each job has a particular part. And studying the body that way got us so far and got us so many things. We do organ transplants because we think of the body as a machine. And so if a part breaks, you can put in a new part, right? We got so far with that notion that people sort of got seduced into thinking, oh, well, since we got so far with it, that must be the only game in town. That must be correct, right? But then I agree, like you hit a ceiling. There's so many things in the body that we cannot explain when you consider it from that perspective. But then when you sort of shift your thinking over to, okay, the body is a system instead, very much embedded in an environment, and all of that matters, suddenly, okay, well, we can also explain everything the machine metaphor did. We can go a little further, and we can look at non-obvious causality, and we can start looking at other ways to understand the body and just get that a little bit further, a little bit more. Start asking different questions.
Yeah. In many cases, get out of the lab right into the real world, like especially like things I'm interested in, So yeah, no, I completely agree. It's just, you're right. The other approach, we've learned a lot and accomplished a lot, but it's just it's almost become its own industry, right? You start with this decisions, and you kind of follow on, and you build this paradigm. These paradigms for studying motor control, button pressing or reaching through a force field, and then you go off and you really explain the science of that rather than, that's what I always, like I loved about Gibson, immediately wanted to get out of the lab. Like he cared about driving and landing planes and not about his lab tasks. So yeah, that's Good points.
I agree entirely. And I feel like that whole perspective ends up putting you in blinders and stopping you from asking a different set of questions, right? Just like you said, you get into the button pressing and you did that. And then suddenly you're not allowed to go and look at someone doing cartwheels outside and talk about that instead, So exactly. It opens up new avenues when you consider it a different way.
Yeah. No, I think that's really, and I think that's really, those are good points. And so moving on, you have chapters where you talk about the different senses and kind of information. Hey, Jeff, can you talk a little bit, like, for example, getting the idea of the ecological optics and the array, moving beyond kind of the traditional retina kind of, can you talk a little bit about that, trying to explain information to people? How did you kind of approach that?
Yeah, that is a challenge, and it's doubly challenging because I think as much good work as Gibson did in developing the ecological approach, he made it difficult because he used words that already had certain meanings, like information, which, in the way we normally use information, it means almost the opposite of what we mean in ecological psychology, which is really unfortunate. But, instead of information as data, that's how it's normally used, we're talking about information as like lawful relations. That there's this, that objects and events lawfully structure stimulation patterns, and that because of the lawfulness, that structure is present in multiple energy forms simultaneously. So allowing you to perceive something by vision, by touch, by hearing, or by all of those things simultaneously.
Yeah.
So trying to, and I think the shift that occurred for me in really getting that concept, I think, was this ocean of energy idea. That it's not that the energy has to get into us; it's that we are immersed in it. It's kind of like the joke or the saying that fish never talk about water. Because it's just they're in it, right? They don't need to talk about it, and that's the way I thought. Oh, well, that's us. We are immersed in an ocean of structured light, of structured sound, of structured smell, of odors, and I think once you think about that, of you being embedded in this, then it becomes clearer that you are just detecting structure rather than having to generate the structure.
Create the meaning. You don't have to create meaning out of the environment. Yeah, Julia, do you have any comment about that kind of information, direct perception ideas?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what was going through my head as I was listening to that was that for him the hook in was the ocean of light, and for me the hook in was the direct causality not being a thing we had to stick to. And I just find it really interesting that people who come into this field, everybody's got a different way, right? Everybody found a different hook into understanding it. And just like that reversible figure that he was talking about earlier, the thing that kind of made it go, oh, wait, oh, I get it. I understand how we can. So that's what I was thinking about while he was talking, which is, my hook in, because that's what we do. And that's how I wrote those first 4 chapters, was on the thing that hooked me into it, which was understanding where the assumptions went wrong. That's how I got into it and kind of went, okay, I can get behind all of that. Sounds like the ocean of light was his. And I don't know, I just find that interesting.
No, I love that. That's a wonderful metaphor too, I think. I think you're right. Everyone kind of has a different, it's one of those things, again, I think people on the surface, it makes sense. And then you think about it more and you're like, oh, that's a big deal. If that's true, that's a big game changer. So, I think that's a great way. I like the, I remember talking to Dave Lee and he talking about, he thinks we see the world as a world of cows, right? All around us, and, time to contacts and, information and, so same kind of idea, sea of cows, right? So I was like, oh yeah. Yeah.
I heard cows.
Oh, did you? Sorry.
Cows, and I was like, that. I'm very confused by the metaphor, but I'm going with you.
Yeah. What?
I heard cows too.
Oh, did you? Okay, well, maybe I'll have to edit that one. He does live in Scotland, so maybe they're those big cows they have there. One of the things I really appreciated you guys included in this, because it's something I get asked about all the time, is your chapter Thinking, Learning, and Remembering. You're telling me there's thinking in the ecological approach and memory. Can you talk a little bit about that, Julia, how you wanted to bring those things across?
So this is one of the chapters also that Jeff wrote. I think this might be a better question for him. I was with him on it, and I agree, but he's going to have more insight into how that chapter got structured.
Yeah. Okay. Jeff.
Sure. Well, I think we can do a lot. I think a lot happens when we consider that perceiving as a process. Mm-hmm. If we talk about perception as a noun or a thing, or it shrinks it down to an instant, and then we have to explain, well, how do we get from this instant to that instant? How do we get to the past if we're have stimulation that's occurring in the present? And I think we can change the game by saying, well, okay, perceiving is a process that takes place over time, right? It doesn't really start or stop there. It's not about an instant. And once you do that, then you start removing these boundaries, and you see that, well, if perceiving takes 10 minutes, well, then it's also about connection with things that have happened, not just what is happening. And if perceiving is about affordances, which are prospective, then you're in contact with the present, the past, and the future right now. Mm-hmm. There's no need for sort of separate imagining to get to the future or remembering to get to the past. And I think one of the best, the way that Gibson talked about this was in terms of the occluding edges, right? You have two surfaces, that one surface that blocks another moves in front of another, and it is telling you about, what's behind that surface. You don't have to remember, because the pattern of occlusion and disocclusion is telling you this is still here. Mm-hmm. You just can't see it at the moment. And so just the appreciation that perceiving is a process, that it takes place over time, and that it stretches out your awareness. Perceiving, remembering, I always challenge people to tell me when the present stops. At what point does the present become the past? Mm-hmm. And I think, in our experience, you can put your finger on, 30 years ago when I was in high school, okay, that's clearly the past, sure. But, in more everyday experience, it's much harder to do.
Yeah. I think you're right. Changing things to verbs. I think we've lost what we're trying to explain, right? We're trying to explain how our system, our body can be influenced by things that happened before and be guided by a goal in the future. But we've assumed it's done by memory and we've built in the assumption that it's pulling things out. I think we've lost what we're trying to explain. You can have something that's influenced by the past experience without memory, right? In the traditional sense, right? So I think that's a great way to put it. And maybe what about cognition? I think you say you use cognizing instead of cognition. Yeah. How do you kind of pull that into explaining the ecological approach?
And we probably made that unnecessarily complicated.
No, I love it.
You like cognizing? But yeah, so, and that's another continuity. I think you can get a lot of work done by describing perceiving as just in the same way that perceiving is continuous with acting. or moving, that it's continuous with thinking or cognizing, that you are and continuous with remembering.
Mm-hmm.
And that thinking, if that's true, then then thinking is continuous with acting. And so you have thinking with your body, you do things to think.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking is not necessarily internal. It's probably in its most general case external. The counting on your fingers or the making a sketch, that those are all examples of thinking. And that's the thinking is done in the most general case in the relationship between the animal and the environment. And the thinking that, I'm going to use a lot of thinking. The thinking that we normally think about as imagining, that's derivative to me. Those are experiences that are, you can do that, but that's the built top of
Mm-hmm.
the thinking that occurs with the body and with other things.
Mm-hmm.
That's an unusual. That's the exception, not the rule. That's the it's not the general case.
Yeah.
So I think now I'm doing it. I think the important thing about the cognizing is that regardless of the kind of thinking, whether it's can I jump over there, or I wonder what my kids are doing right now because they're being awfully quiet, they're still going to be governed by the same processes, right? We're still going to have the same resonance with our environment. We're still going to have the same embedded in an event, and that event is influencing us and we're influencing that event. All of that is still going to be happening regardless of what that qualitative experience is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important for us to reconceptualize all of those like classically cognitive ideas, the stuff that's taught in a class on cognition,
Mm-hmm.
right? Taking those ideas and understanding them using the same lawfulness and the same, emergence and the same resonance, all out of those same principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree. And I agree, kind of the idea we can kind of do the traditional, for example, in sports research, a lot of research on decision making in sports is studied by retrospective recall. Like weeks later, you ask an athlete, why did you decide to pass to your teammate there? Well, if you ask someone, they're going to be able to come up with something, like some description. But sure, the idea that that's what they're doing in the moment is very different. What they're doing in the moment, I like your, that they're all embedded with each other. I think it's like the key. It's not that we're not saying people don't think. it's just all, ecological psychology for a while was accused of being behaviorism, right? It's information action automatically driven, right? So I think it is important to keep this, talking about this. Yeah. A couple of other guys, you have a big, maybe Julia, talk about the social psychology side of it. You had you have a good section on that as well.
Yeah, so that is a chapter that wasn't in the original plan.
Mm-hmm.
So we came up with an outline for the book, and to do that, we drew from a number of sources, not least of which is the direct perception book you mentioned earlier. That was a huge influence. And we were going to have a chapter on affordances, and that was the plan. And then as we started writing the book, we started realizing there's just too much. There's too much for just one chapter on affordances. We're going to have to expand this into 2 chapters and include that social affordance stuff. And I love it because I think, again, going back to what the book is, it's intended to be handed to someone who doesn't know our field. Mm-hmm. And this is the daily experience we have the most. right? Or at least the one we think about the most is, how do I interact with that person? How do I know to walk down the street? Do I have to move around that person, or is that person going to move around me? And can I fit in between those two people? Those sort of social experiences that we have are so much a part of our everyday that we had to have all of that research in there. And I've always found that social stuff to be really interesting. And I imagine it is also particularly useful when you're talking about our main audience here, right, who are into sports.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to be done in like coordinating with team members. And so that's where that
for sure. Sure. The idea of shared affordances is really starting to make its way into team coordination. Yeah, Jeff?
And that's the research on the social affordances is probably the work in the field of ecological psychology that's gotten the most traction in the last 15 or 20 years. Some of the really amazing work on coordination with other people, even on intentional coordination, in or outside of the context of sports. I think that has really grabbed both researchers and the general public as it should. It's really fascinating. And I think Julie's right, because it meets our lived experience. Of everyone's had the experience of trying to avoid someone in your walking path, and you end up doing this dance with them. Then you're like, well, that was weird. But and the idea that the way we coordinate with others is the very same way we coordinate with ourselves.
Yes.
Taking that, if there's a lawfulness to it, then there's a lawfulness to it all the way up and down. And so seeing that, or showing that those principles apply, not just in the way I move my own body, but the way I move my own body in coordination with the way you're moving your body. So that I thought that is fascinating to me.
Yeah. No, I agree. I've always been fascinated that line of research, and I think you're right. I think demonstrating the same principles work across, different systems. I think, one of the strengths of ecological psychology for sure. The last section of your book, I was wondering whether you were tempted to stop after part 2, right? Because for example, I think some people would claim you don't really need to talk about dynamical systems to explain ecological psychology. Okay, Julia shaking your head. Okay.
I could not disagree more.
Me too, but I was trying being the devil's advocate here. Yeah, what do you think?
No, so that last section is my favorite section, honestly. I mean, no, don't get me wrong. I love the rest of the book, but those concepts at the end are some of my favorite to think about. And I don't think you can give a thoroughgoing explanation of ecological psych without getting into dynamical systems and without getting into self-organization, because it leaves this open question, right? We say it in the book, it has to be self-organized because the only other option is other organized. And once you open the door to other organized, we are talking about some mythical central executive or God or whatever.
Yeah.
And so you have to explain how we do this, or you can't keep going down this road. Right. They made the choices they made because there didn't seem to be a path down that road. And the path down that road is through dynamical systems and through self-organization. You can't get there without those. So I absolutely think those were necessary. Plus, I think that once you get your head around those concepts, those are also things you start seeing everywhere, right? Particularly dynamical systems. I just feel like anytime you enter into, like you go into a classroom and the students all sit down in their chairs, right? They've self-organized into that, or watching a room try and make a decision and watch as then, eventually everybody comes around to a choice. You start seeing those as patterns, right? You start seeing those as dynamical systems, and we all fell towards that attractor, or that's the language I find creeps into my everyday speech the most is talking about behaviors as attractors, right? Or, he can't help but do that thing. There's a strong attractor there for that, So So I disagree. I think you can't do ecological psych.
I agree 100%. I was being right. You kind of leave the story finished if you don't.
Unfinished,
right?
That's right.
If someone's not coordinating and organizing me, who does it then? Yeah. Jeff, what are your thoughts about talking about those things?
I think it's essential to the ecological approach. It is. I think having those tools are what these are the lawful principles that apply across the systems, right? We can have models for how we coordinate, our fingers and have phase transitions, and we see the very same things when we coordinate with other people and we coordinate movements of our limbs with theirs. I think it is the language or the mathematics that underlie a lot of what we do in ecological psychology. So I think having those concepts and the dynamical systems approach also, I think, lines up quite nicely with a field-based perspective, which is really what this idea of information and non-local causes is about. That dynamical systems allows you to describe the field, and that changes in that field can change behavior, but not in the way and that is what removes the homunculus of the central executive. The changes in the field create the attractors that cause the behavior, so that you're sort of being the behavior is being pulled rather than pushed, right? So it's not being pushed from you. You're sort of, and this is the way getting off a little bit of a tangent. When I think about how the wind works, the wind is just air moving, filling a vacuum, right? So when you feel the wind, you're feeling the pull. You're not feeling push. It feels a lot like I'm getting pushed back, but really I'm being pulled from behind.
Right.
And so that, when you think about the field-based perspective, that's the way you can explain behavior behavior is not coming from the inside out. It's coming from around. It's coming from around in. And using the tools of dynamical systems is a way to do that mathematically. Yeah.
No, I love that, Jeff. I love it. It reminds me of one of my favorite Gibson papers is Gibson and Crookes driving. The driving as a projecting fields and sensing, like when you drive, you project a field to keep people away from you. And, it's I think that's a fascinating idea. I really like that. When we get into the dynamical system, this is something we talked about a little bit before we started recording, Julia, this is where we start to get, especially, it's some in the earlier parts too, but in the big words, right? Yeah. The really complicated terminology that, I still have a lot of people complain, like, you're just sounding smart. Why do I need to use attractor instead of saying people have tendencies or something? Can you talk, I know that you said that was something that you wanted motivations for writing this book, right?
Yeah. So one of my biggest motivations for writing this book is that when I first started trying to understand not just the simple stuff, but the really complex stuff in our field, I ran into exactly the same wall where I was like, but there's so many words here that seem to have one meaning to me, but obviously have a different meaning to them. And that was difficult, right? To get my head around. And one of the lessons that Michael Turvey taught us in grad school was about the importance of vocabulary, right? That we are specifically using words in a way for a reason. And it does mean that you end up having to learn the jargon, right? But what it also means is that we're deliberately moving our field away from other things, right? So the reason we use attractor instead of using the word tendency is because tendency brings up a sort of statistical inference, right? Tendency, you start going, okay, I've tallied the number of times a person walked their feet this way and they walked it this way the most often. So they have a tendency towards that. And tendency is a word you hear in statistics, right? Central tendency is like one of the main concepts in statistics. We are deliberately moving away from that. in an effort to understand the system as being dynamic, right? By which we mean constantly moving, constantly changing, and needing still to be able to describe the way a thing would constantly move and constantly change.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the examples that I gave in the book was about a person at a job that they sometimes hate and they sometimes love, but they never feel sort of middle about. Mm-hmm. And if you took an average of that person's feeling about their job, they would have a sort of a middle of the road feeling about their job. That tendency, right? Because that's what you would get, is that mm-hmm. central tendency mm-hmm. does not in any way describe that person's experience.
Right.
So we use a different word because we're deliberately trying to make a different point.
Yeah.
So yes, it does mean that people have to learn a new vocabulary in order to do these things this way. But I promise it's not because we're trying to sound smart or because we're trying to make other people feel dumb, which is the way it used to feel to me when I was reading those things.
I get a lot of that, yeah, for sure. And
not on purpose.
No,
but trying to make me feel dumb, but I did feel dumb a lot of the time when I was reading.
Yeah, I think that's, you're making some key point. Like there's a precision and a meaning to these words. Like the frustrates me is like any other science. If I took nutrition and you said, okay, here's a carbohydrate, and I went, oh, that's just a sugar. That just means sugar.
Right.
You wouldn't be able to get away with that. Everyone would go, whoa, whoa.
Everybody would be like, no.
Like carbohydrate has a specific meaning. But in this discipline, people are like, nah, it doesn't matter. Like, yeah.
To be fair, I think the same thing happens in nutrition, right? Mm-hmm. I think you get into somebody and you're starting to learn how to study that, and you say carbohydrate, you're like, oh, that's a sugar. And it's like, no, that's a layperson's understanding of carbohydrate. Mm-hmm. You need to understand this specifically in order to get to the next part of this, mm-hmm. right? You're not gonna be able to unlock the next set of information here and not in the Gibsonian sense, right? You're not going to be able to understand the next part of this unless you can understand that we mean something specific by this.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's just our field that runs into
No, me too. Yeah, for sure. Jeff?
What we're trying to do is, I think, avoid some of the problems that Gibson did create when he used the same words mm-hmm. like information.
Yes.
And I think, so we have to have these precise words, but it's also because, and really to avoid the intuitions that come along mm-hmm. with the words that are more familiar. Like tendency, why don't we use the word tendency? Because tendencies, the intuition there is that applies to living systems only, and particularly animate systems, and in particular people. When really what we're trying to find a way to do is to explain that concept, but in all natural systems, right? The way a river moves has to do with attractors, but not really tendencies. You wouldn't say that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more powerful to use a more general term that applies across the systems we're talking about than the term that's probably more familiar but limiting in what we can draw from it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think and a lot of words come loaded with theoretical assumptions that people have long kind of forgotten their assumptions, right? So I think you're right. That's a really good point. Yeah. So I'm glad you included those sections in there. I think you tied them in nicely. Maybe the last thing, can you talk a little bit about the very last, the intelligent life, Jeff? I thought that was a nice way to end things off. Yeah.
Well, this was this was a chapter that Julia had.
I've been guessing the wrong thing all day.
That's totally fine.
I'll edit these out, guys. So don't. I just been going alternating instead of asking you. No. Yeah.
So the intelligent life chapter sprung out of when I was in graduate school. We got a grant from to define the word intelligence. I think there might have been more to the general grant than just that one thing, but that was what we spent a lot of our time on, was trying to understand what we as ecological psychologists meant by the word intelligence, talk about trying to understand vocabulary. And that debate has stuck with me ever since. I ended up writing a paper with a group of other people on plant intelligence, and how interesting it was that all of these things that we see other life forms doing, we see plants doing, and over again in our field, you see there is nothing uniquely human. There is nothing that isn't being done by so many other species. And then you start going, well, okay, so is intelligence and life maybe the same thing? When you start digging into it deep enough, if we're going to define intelligence, and we ultimately decided to go with physical intelligence because that helped us understand it as being different from something like an IQ test could measure, right? If we're going to go that way, is this different from life? So that debate just stuck with me forever, and I just always thought that was a very interesting topic. And so this is how it ended up getting included in the book.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think I've been doing some things in that. The one I always fight against is the intelligent. Our body is intelligent, not just our brain is intelligent. I think that that recaps the whole idea of intelligence, right? As we would think about it. Yeah. And the symmetry, symmetrical view of everything, I think is another good, you guys do a good job of bringing across. That's a really important idea. So maybe Jeff, can you tell us, so where is this available? And if you have any concluding things you want to say, I'll come back to you too, Julie, after.
Yeah, of course.
Where is this available?
Yeah, everywhere, all your good bookstores.
You can buy it on Amazon, just like you can buy Rob Gray's book.
Oh, hiding. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take the free plug. You
can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it on Routledge, is our publisher. But really, anywhere you buy your books. We have heard from people who have read it, and they people for who we didn't know beforehand. So before we were getting encouragement from people we knew, and now we're getting encouragement from people that we don't, which is great. We're really pleased that people are excited about it, and we hope that our goal is to make a field that we think is right and that does so much work, that can do so much work, not just in explaining perception action, but everything about intelligent systems. We want to make that accessible to everybody. We want to, and so we hope that that's what this does.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jeff. And I just, one of the things I wanted to mention, it's hard to convey in the audio podcast that I really enjoyed about your book is the illustrations and the figures. I think you are really great at conveying some of the ideas. Yeah.
That's all Julia.
Yeah, that's yours, Julia? Yeah.
And Drew, all of them.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Yeah.
So a quick story about that. So Fred, the main character in the book, is a creation that came out of Michael Turvey's teaching class. When I was a graduate student, we all had to take this class, and I created Fred to do what he does in the book, right? Which is to be an explainer of things, right? By encountering a situation and say, okay, what is Fred's experience? What's happening here with this? And I created him at the time, and now I can't teach without him, right? He's in every one of my classes, from research methods to biopsychology to the intro to welcome to my Central Connecticut State University campus lecture has Fred in it. Because I don't know how to teach without him. So when we started working on what's the book going to be like? What is it going to look like? I was like, I have to have Fred. I literally don't know how I would explain this without him. So we decided to have him be throughout. And so it meant that we had, and I feel very strongly about pictures. I feel very strongly about figures and having them explain that way, because I think that way. I think in sexual relationships. So it was very important to me. So there's 160 something figures in the book. And I think 160 of them are drawn by me. There's a handful of photographs, and I want to give credit where credit is due. My mom took the photographs
Cool.
Aside from the one of the apple tree, my mom took all of those. Oh, and the ones of the stairs. My mom took the rest of those photos.
Cool. Yeah.
So give credit where credit is due on those. But everyone that is an actual figure, I hand drew that, including the cockpit of the plane and all of those dials. That took a while.
Yes. You're probably one dial in. You were like, why did I decide to do that?
Why did I do this? Right. I absolutely did. Okay, well, I'm in it now.
Yeah. No, I think that really helps a lot. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
I think you make Michael Turvey proud, because one of his challenges to his students was in teaching was to cartoonize concepts, to see if you can come up with a compact, accessible way to get a concept across. And then, so that's exactly what Julia did. She cartoonized 160 different concepts in our book.
Yeah. No, the other thing, I think we've talked about it before. Obviously, you guys have come from a great tradition of you're standing on the shoulder of giants. You might, and it really comes across in the book. You can see people's influences, and that's really nice. I enjoyed that part as well. So, sorry.
Another fun fact about those drawings are really all the characters in the book, with the exception of Fred. Every one of the other characters in that book is named after an ecological trait. So his best friend is Claudia, who's named after Claudia Carello, who is both of our advisor, and so on. So, for the interested reader, you can go through and see if you can figure out who each one of those people is.
That's cool. Okay. So, well, thank you for joining me, guys. I would highly, highly recommend this book, obviously. And, I couldn't say enough about it. I think it's, understanding these concepts is really, really important. And it's a very enjoyable read as well. So for a textbook, I thought, especially, so thank you very much for joining me. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Gone through St. Louis.